the Lewis and Clark expedition, an undisputed turning point in the American narrative. The journey of these explorers would change their lives, those of the people they met, and indeed, the very shape of this country. Captains Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and the members of the Corps of Discovery would be celebrated and mythologized in their lifetimes and beyond. Even the young Shoshone woman, Sacagawea, found a place of honor in this story. But there is one member of the expedition for whom we are still searching, still seeking his story, his truth. His life and the many ways it has been interpreted have much to teach us about our country then and our country now. His name was York.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the James F. and Marion L. Miller Foundation, the Ann and Bill Swindell's Charitable Trust, the Oregon Cultural Trust, and from viewers like you. Thank you.
The journey to find York has been a long one, and at times a mysterious one. Born as a slave to the family of William Clark, his own thoughts are not known to us. The perspectives of enslaved people were seldom recorded since they were legally forbidden to learn to read and write. What we know of York comes solely from the accounts and interpretations of others, in his time and in the centuries that followed. There are just a handful of primary sources which reference him from the days of the expedition. Where York is concerned, the Corps of Discovery journals are often tantalizingly sketchy in their depictions.
The journals weren't really being written for the kinds of questions that we raise today. It was less important for them to, quote, establish the role of York or to talk about York and his significance in terms of the expedition than it was simply to report on the flora and fauna or to report on the various experiences of the expedition in general.
We have to remember that the journals are not products that are handed down on tablets from the sky. The journals are products that are created by men of a particular generation, a particular social class, who participate in a particular racial culture.
We may be asking too much of the historical record, and that, of course, leads to the kind of speculation about who York was, what he did, and the rest.
In addition, there are the Native American oral traditions informing the story of York, which, while providing an important, often overlooked perspective, present their own interpretive challenges.
If you want to know what our people thought of our first contact with Europeans or Americans, you have to hear it from the oral tradition. And the great challenge there is that there are many who have difficulty believing that if it doesn't have a date and it isn't written, that it doesn't have veracity. It is not authentic and its validity can be questioned.
It's kind of like taking an object and looking at it from many different directions. Taking those many different perspectives all into account will give us a better understanding of the object as a whole.
In the years following the expedition, other historical and fictional accounts cropped up, and with many of them came a preponderance of inaccuracy, prejudice, and stereotype, reflecting the attitudes of the times in which they were written.
He was bullet-headed, ivory-toothed, with a smile to be measured with a foot.
He was a black conqueror, leaving behind his copper-skinned captives.
As a voluntary bodyguard, he would not be parted from his master.
For sure, who could take care of Master Clark so well as old York?
None of these stereotypical depictions have any basis in fact, but they are powerful in the ways in which they persist. And so, there is a York of fact and a York of fiction. And we are left to sift through all these images to try and formulate a more accurate picture of the man.
the image that has been created of York in each succeeding generation has been an image that reflects the racial realities and conventions of that particular generation.
Flag racing, take one.
And finally, as we think about who York was, it's worth noting that even a documentary like this one is simply another interpretation of the pieces of historical information currently at our disposal. So what do we really know about this man named York? We do know York's family had long been enslaved to the Clark family. In fact, York's father had been a highly trusted servant to Clark's father. We don't know exactly when York was born, but slaveholding tradition suggests that as William Clark's hand-picked body servant, York would have been roughly the same age as Clark, born in 1770. We do know that when the Clark family moved from Virginia to Kentucky in the 1780s, York's extended family made the move with them. We also know that as a body servant, York took part in the life inside the Clark home.
When anybody had a number of enslaved African Americans, they of course had those that were more tied to the household and took care of the duties of like the washing, the cooking, helping with children, being companions to children. York, both in Virginia and Kentucky, was basically a playmate and a companion and then a body servant, an assistant to William Clark.
We can safely assume, given the twisted, often brutal nature of slavery, that the long, close relationship between York and Clark was a deeply complicated one that is often hard for us to understand.
One of the biggest problems in studying history for our generation is to not be judgmental and not to judge earlier periods, earlier individuals by the standards and the values and the context that we operate in our own generation. And that certainly is true when we come to our attempts to understand the relationship between William Clark and York as master and slave. On one level, it's simply going to be impossible for us to understand the dynamics of that relationship. None of us will ever be a slave master. None of us in our generation will ever be a slave.
But what is clear is that the complexities of slavery made York an integral part of William Clark's life.
Growing up on the frontier, York would have done essentially anything that Clark did as a young man. So in that sense, they would have shared experiences, but of course they would have gotten a slightly different version of that experience.
In 1803, Captain Meriwether Lewis, a trusted aide to President Jefferson, contacted Clark, his old friend and former Army comrade. Lewis was offering Clark equal command of a transcontinental expedition to chart unfamiliar terrain, find a commercial route to the Pacific, and to make contact with native peoples. And Lewis was seeking Clark's help in assembling a group of men most capable of making this journey.
And so he asked Clark to begin finding some permanent members, hardy young frontiersmen, woodsmen, hunters, single. They don't know if they're ever coming back. They don't want to leave wives and children behind, capable of bearing, as he puts it, bodily fatigue to a pretty considerable degree. York, who is, again, a product of the frontier, he can do all the same things that these other men can do. Clark probably did not hesitate for a moment.
And so the notion that York was somehow a luxury for William Clark on that expedition is simply ludicrous. York was selected with the same characteristics and values and potential and qualities in mind as the rest of the members of that expedition were.
Though obviously skilled, York was not considered an official member of the Corps of Discovery. His slave status never entirely forgotten.
In looking at the relationship of William Clark and York, sometimes people think, oh, these guys grew up together, they went on the expedition together. They were friends. Well, they were lifelong companions, but we should never, ever make the mistake of thinking of them as friends, because they weren't. It was master and slave. owner and property.
Despite his lowly status, the journals seem to suggest that York participated fully in the life of the expedition.
And we get no mention in the journals that York was not accepted by the other men. I mean, he goes out on these little parties away from Clark to hunt or to trade with the Indians for goods and things like that. So apparently he just becomes one of the men with a different type of status, however, as a slave and as, more importantly, Captain Clark's servant, Captain Clark's slave.
I think that's the key point. As I said, he starts out as a body servant, and I think William Clark had certain expectations, and I'm sure the rest of the crew, or the rest of the members of the expedition had certain expectations of York, and those expectations were met and exceeded over time. And thus, I think people began to rethink how they felt about York, and that's seen in some of the journal accounts. That York becomes more and more important.
While York was well qualified to participate in the expedition, he did not fit Lewis's original profile in one important way. Unlike most of the members of the Corps of Discovery, York had a wife.
We know that York's wife was owned by somebody else. Of course, it wasn't a legal marriage. That was not recognized in slavery, that you would be legally married. It would have been, as the old saying is jumping the broom. You know, it would have been something that was like more of a common understanding.
Neither of them could ever have guessed that they would be apart for nearly 2.5 years. Whatever personal pain York might have felt did not prevent him from doing his duty and serving Clark and often the other members of the expedition as well.
Sergeant Floyd was taken violently bad with a bilious colic and is dangerously ill. We attempt in vain to relieve him. I am much concerned for his situation. Every man is attended to him, York principally. William Clark.
York also demonstrated his loyalty and concern when he frantically searched for Clark, the traitor Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and her infant son, all of whom had almost drowned during a flash flood at Great Falls.
We at length reached the top of the hill safe, where I found my servant in search of us, greatly agitated for our welfare. William Clark.
But York's presence on the expedition may have been most valuable when it came to their dealings with the various native peoples they encountered.
Those Indians were much astonished at my servant. They never saw a black man before. All flocked around him and examined him from top to toe and called him the Big Medicine. William Clark.
Because York was black and because many of the Indian tribes sort of held that color as a warrior color, he was seen as having immediate authenticity and respect with the Indian tribes. And so he could play a role of emissary between those two groups.
There are points in the expedition where the very survival and success of the expedition depended on the loyalty of York. At one point, they had no food, they had very few trade goods, they needed the goodwill of the native population simply for their survival. And in those circumstances, York rose to the fore as one of the individuals who really allowed that expedition to proceed.
When you look at the oral tradition, and you look at our suspicions about these travelers, one of the most notable things that you'll find in tribes from the Dakotas to the west is our fascination with York. Absolute fascination with York. The color of his skin, the fact that he was apart from the rest of the men, he was not like the rest of the men in many respects, was not wasted on us. And his skill, being a man's man in Indian country is really important.
A strong, capable, responsible member of the party. That's generally how the journals and native oral tradition portray York. And yet, in later years, some references inadvertently provided fodder were impressed with York's agility and ability to dance. Several authors took the image of a dancing York and transformed him into a buffoon, reinforcing the prejudices of the day.
The ferocity in York's face faded to startled innocence. Cruzat struck up the fiddle, and York began to shuffle, buck and wing, heel and toe, no bones in his hips and no bones in his legs. Julia Davis, 1937.
Fictionalized accounts like this show how authors of later generations cherry-picked incidents to support their stereotypes. In this case, York reduced to a character in a minstrel show.
In reality, the expedition danced every day. They danced every evening. That was their primary form of entertainment and, to a degree, exercise and relaxation. Every member of the expedition participated in that. But those people who are intent on portraying York as this Sambo figure and who want to attach to York all the traditional negative racial stereotypes that have been associated with black males to try and denigrate them over time, they will pick a particular incident like that and use that as evidence that York was somehow different and distinct and inferior to the other members of the expedition, and perceived to be that by the native population.
Though there's scant reference made to sexual contact between York and Native American women in journal-related material, other literary portrayals denigrate York as sexually voracious. Some later authors focused large portions of their books on York's supposed sexual appetite. One 1958 novel describes York as a black bull, while another of that same era purports that the white men of the party withstood the temptation well.
When we create heroes like we did out of the Lewis and Clark story, those heroes have to meet certain standards. And included in those standards was not sexual activity. So on the one hand, we dirty York's reputation by allowing that kind of sexual depiction of him. And on the other hand, we cleanse the other members of the expedition by pretending that they weren't engaged in that kind of activity.
In more recent history, with the dawn of the civil rights era, some authors attempted to correct these images of York. Some presented York as a role model. Some succeeded in offering a balanced portrait, but a few others took it too far.
York went from being portrayed consistently as a Sambo to being portrayed consistently as the superhero of the expedition, the most important member. And certainly we can understand the swing of that pendulum in that direction, but pendulums have a way of swinging all the way to extremes before they find their way back to the middle. And either the Sambo or the superhero treatment of York fails to capture the realities of York's humanity and complexity.
Of the many stories concerning York's role in the expedition, perhaps one of the best known is the one describing a small but symbolic moment at the mouth of the Columbia River in the winter of 1805. Facing miserable weather, running out of trade goods, and chronically concerned about food, Lewis and Clark polled the Corps of Discovery on where they would spend the coming months. Both York and Sacagawea were included in the vote to winter over at Fort Clatsop.
Anyone wishing to stay where we are on this side of the river, raise your hand.
It didn't change his status as a slave. It didn't change her status as the wife of an interpreter. But it did reflect in the record that their voice counted.
One of the things that we often lose when we think about the expedition is the human angle of a group of several dozen individuals facing and surmounting, enduring great difficulties over a long period of time, and the impact that the bonding experience must have had on the members of that expedition that superseded probably in some ways the expectations of the settled society of race that they left back east.
What feelings were stirred in York by his experiences on the expedition? What hopes did he harbor for life after the expedition? As their great adventure was coming to a close, what thoughts were running through his mind? In the fall of 1806, Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery made their triumphant return to the East. Adulation, prestige, Land and financial reward awaited them all. All, that is, except York.
But guess what now? You're back in civilization, and you're supposed to just step right back into that role of loyal, docile, trustworthy slave. And that's it. And York can't do that anymore. You know, things have changed for him, and William just can't recognize that. He can't accept that. And that's where you just get a lot of these human emotions kicking in. And it's sad. I mean, it really is sad for both men.
York received no honors, no money, and for many years, not even his freedom. And though one might imagine York could take comfort in his reunion with his wife, eventually even that would be taken from him. 2 years after their return, Clark was granted an important appointment by Thomas Jefferson in St. Louis, hundreds of miles away. As Clark's body servant, York had to go where his master went.
And you can't help but think that York's kind of thinking, hey, wait a minute now, things have kind of changed. You know, he has a wife. He gets to take her to St. Louis. What about my wife? Then at that point, he starts asking William to either hire him out or sell him to somebody in Louisville so he can be near his wife. And William won't do it.
Yes, Master.
From letters William Clark wrote to his brother Jonathan, we have a vivid portrait in Clark's own words of the increased tensions and growing gulf between him and York.
Dear brother, I wrote you in both of my last letters about York. I do wish to do well by him, but as he has got such a notion about freedom and his immense services that I do not expect he will be of much service to me again. I do not think... Dear brother, if any attempt is made by York to run off or refuse to perform his duty as a slave, I wish him sent to New Orleans and sold or hired out to some severe master until he thinks better of such conduct. I do not wish him... Dear brother, York brought me my horse. He is here but a very little service to me. He is insolent and sulky. I gave him a severe trouncing the other day, and he has much mended since. Your affectionate brother, William Clark.
So you get real insight into the complexities of slavery as an institution. Two people growing up as friends suddenly become master and slave, and the effect that has on their relationship. And they go off and they do this incredible thing. They trace through the Corps of Discovery lands that had never been traced before for the American government, and then they come back and their relationship really deteriorates. And you get a sense of how the institution of slavery really kind of controlled the behavior of the people that were within that institution in really awful ways.
It's just this real stew of human emotions, and you mix it with the master, the slave owner mindset, but yet the personal view of William Clark feeling he's kind of gotten rejected. And it makes for just a very unfortunate situation in how he ends up dealing with York.
Though the exact date is uncertain, it is known from Clark family records that 10 years after the Corps of Discovery returned from the Pacific, York was finally granted his freedom. What happened to him next is largely a matter of speculation, based on two brief and extremely different accounts.
There are two versions of the end of York's life that have come down to us. One version is the result of an interview of William Clark by Washington Irving, a popular cultural writer and figure in the 1830s. And Washington Irving went to interview him, and Irving asked him about York. What happened to your slave, your manservant York?
Clark told Irving that he'd freed York, giving him a wagon and 6 horses to start a freight delivery business.
The wagoner was York, the hero of the Missouri expedition and advisor of the Indians. He could not get up early enough in the morning. His horses were ill-kept, 2 died, the others grew poor. He sold them, was cheated, entered into service, fared ill. "Damn this freedom," said York. "I have never had a happy day since I got it." He determined to go back to his old master. He set off for St. Louis but was taken with the cholera in Tennessee and died. Washington Irving.
It was just a routine expectation and assumption on the part of slaveholders that black people preferred to be slaves, preferred slavery to freedom. And so that Washington Irving story becomes an intimate part of the Clark York story in the scholarship of the next 200 years. The insistence that York did not want to be free, that York wanted to return to Clark and to return to slavery.
There is another story which speaks to the hope for a different ending for York. It too dates back to 1832. Like Washington Irving's notes, it is the unverified account of one person, a mountain man named Zenas Leonard, who had been traveling the Rockies when he came upon a Crow Indian camp.
In this village, we found a Negro man who informed us that he first came to this country with Lewis and Clark, with whom he also returned to the state of Missouri and in a few years returned again. He has acquired a correct knowledge of their manner of living and speaks their language fluently. He has rose to be quite a considerable character or chief in their village. Zenas Leonard.
So that's the alternative fate for York. Now, just as in the case of the William Clark story, you have to re-examine that story as well. There's no doubt that Zenas Leonard was in that Indian village in the 1830s and met a black man there. There is considerable question about whether that black man was really York or not. To assume he was York, we have to forget or overlook the fact that there were many black mountain men. And we tend to do that in American history because we always pretend that York was the only black man in the West. Therefore, it's consistent that he was the black man in the Indian village.
But just as in Irving's account of York dying as he tries to return to his master Clark, there is no corroborating evidence that York lived out his life as a respected member of the Crow Nation.
So still we are left with that frustration. Which story is true? Well, the good side of the frustration is we get to pick, because the evidence is pretty shaky for both stories. Pick the one that you like. I know which one is my preferred ending to York's life, and feel free to stick with that.
In the end, perhaps the details of York's story are less important than the bigger picture his life provides. His personal history blazing a trail through our country's history over the last 2 centuries. Maybe York's life is one map, one way of gauging our own national journey as we continue to struggle with the legacy of slavery and issues of inequality. In a life of service, skill, reliability, and courage, York's greatest contribution may be the way in which his story helps us understand ourselves.
To learn more about York or to order a DVD of this program, go to opb.org.